So my background, I was a school counselor for 26 years, 6 years at Cedar Lily High School, way back, and then 20 years in a middle school in Ferndale. And then I retired almost 3 years ago, 4 years early. Did 2 bucket lists last year. I went to Israel a year ago. Denny and Nancy were on that trip. We knew each other already, but we got to know each other more in a different level. It was really cool. And then also last July, I wrote a book, and I got permission from Lisa to be able to plug it a little bit. I'll pass it around. Feel free to look at it. It's available through Amazon. No expectation. It's not, to be honest with you, it's not meant for talking about mentoring kids. It's much more about your journey or people you know, and about adversity or a trauma you've been through, and how to be resilient in that, right? It's unique in that it talks about resiliency a lot psychologically, but there's also a very strong spiritual base in there without preaching. And there's my story and other people's stories. So, and I didn't realize till I wrote the book that it really summarizes 30 years of counseling that I've done. You know, and before I became a school counselor, actually more than 30 years, I worked in a drug and alcohol treatment center. So I know a lot about addiction and things like that as well. So I'll pass this around, just kind of look at it if you want. It's available. There's be a handout later to tell you how to get it for somebody you might know or yourself or whatever, that dynamic as well. So on a personal level, last couple of quick fun things about myself. Been married 30 years, have 2 kids, 26-year-old son who's moved back in with us. It's been for good reason, though. Barely graduated from high school. I tease him about that all the time. But yet here he's getting A's and B's studying psychology in Northwest University because he wants to be a counselor. So I said, you know, pretty soon you're going to start to lose your hair too, Ryan. So we joke and tease quite a bit. And then also I've been playing the drums since I was 10. It's a huge outlet in my life. I love it. I play at my church, Christ the King Bellingham. But I'll just be honest with you, I love classic rock, but that's another conversation for another time. So love it. And then one of my biggest outlets in terms of self-care the last 5 years is I'm a huge pickleball fan. So yeah, huge. Yeah, it's so much fun. It's good. Let's just play pickleball instead. It's a beautiful day outside. So that's enough about me. So I want to just start with, if you see at the top of your handout, it says My Journey of Detours and Destinations. I love to think in metaphors. I love to think in metaphors because there's a power behind metaphors and parables and stories. So this is a real life metaphor. So bear with me. I'm going somewhere with this. A year and a half ago, my son and I went on a hike in the Cascades Mountains on a beautiful day like today, but it was in August. It was a lot warmer. Don't we live in a beautiful part of the country? Just amazing. Oh, so went on a hike. Plan A didn't work out because, making a long story short, it stated online that the dirt road going to the trail portion where you go on the trailhead wasn't very safe. So we went by the ranger station and asked, can you tell us about it? Oh no, your car should be fine. Well, these guys were completely wrong. It was only by God's grace that my car was not damaged. It was so bad. And so we turned around, did plan B, and it was a beautiful hike at the end. But here's what's the challenge. I'm in pretty good shape, but here's what's the challenge. 9-mile hike, 4.5 miles up, 4.5 miles down. The 4.5 miles up was 5,000 feet elevation gain. And so it was typically when you go up on a hike, there's spots that are level. This one didn't have that. So between that and the elevation that we were in, I was just fatigued. And my son was too, but even more so I. And so there were times where my mind was more on the car than on the end result, which was a cabin that's absolutely beautiful. If I had my PowerPoint, I'd show you a picture that was on a tower with a cabin on top of it, right? So when we were ascending, I was just so fatigued and I wanted to quit. I was just wiped out and tired. But the one blessing in this is that I happened to go like this and I was all ready to go back. Looked up and just between trees, we saw the cabin right there that was right inside. So that even though I was still fatigued, I was focusing more going forward than back, right? So I was fatigued the rest of the time. And by the time we got up there, I forgot about how fatigued I was because it was so beautiful. Well, why do I share that with you? There's other stuff I can share that were trials going back down. One I will tell you real quick is because plan A didn't work out, plan B did. We ended up hiking rather late to the point that the last quarter mile of our hike was complete darkness. Thank God for flashlights on cell phones, right? Because it was dark as dark, really dark, you know, and so that was a challenge too. But I say that because that is a metaphor for life, not just kids you work with, but even our own life, that life is a journey, is it not? Right? I'm talking about ourselves, not just kids. And we never know what's ahead, no matter what we plan sometimes, right? And sometimes it's really difficult, sometimes it's really easy. And I'll just share this before we move on to the actual notes. There's a guy named John Eldredge who is a Christian-based author, but he wrote some good psychological stuff, and he shared something that I agree with in my role as a counselor. To keep this in mind with your journey, but also kids you mentor, is that he said, and I'm paraphrasing him, this is such a good statement, that the most meaningful things in life are the ones that give us grief, and then also the ones that give us joy, right? And I don't, if I'm always seeing somebody happy and always showing that the optimism of life only, such as Russell Wilson when he was at the Seahawks, I would wonder and question, are you being real with us? You follow what I'm saying? Are you being kind of fake? And there's such a depth to embracing both joy and grief, and sometimes both at the same time. Does that make sense? That's our journey, right? So why do I share that? Because it kind of sets the stage for our journey, just the next hour, but even your journey with your mentee, right? With your mentor, right? That dynamic as well. Kids don't see it as a journey because they literally live in the here and now, especially middle school, but even high school sometimes, right? So keep that in mind. My book, by the way, talks a lot about this concept of journey in terms of that as well. So let's go to the first one. Here's what we're going to do today. We're going to talk about grief, trauma, and then a concept that I believe in so strongly is what's implied in the teaching today is resiliency. What does resiliency mean? I can give you a number of formal definitions, but what resiliency is simply an ability to bounce back from adversity. Does that make sense? To be resilient means to bounce back. That's the key term you need to know, to bounce back, right? And so that's more important than grief or trauma. We're going to focus on what does it mean to be resilient and your role as a mentor to help kids to be resilient without necessarily being a counselor, right? Oh, by the way, I love the stuff that you guys shared earlier, because what I would summarize some things that I heard that tells me you are really good mentors without realizing it is two key things, is that you listen, right? Which means that implies that you listen more than you give advice, right? And that's a win-win with kids. And I think it's you that shared, maybe not exactly these terms, but to be curious means that we ask curious questions. That's a win-win. If you want to write that down, even apart from what we're going to talk about today with kiddos, that's a win-win when you listen and ask curious questions, right? Far more than giving advice. And even there's a place for that as well. And that's what I heard from several of you, is to listen and to be curious, right? So this makes sense, right? So being aware of that. So let's talk about grief first. And if we can have Lisa or Brian pass out this one right here. As you're about to get it, I'm going to explain this a little bit. The reason why I'm doing this is because I don't want you to get all the handouts at once, because some people are so OCD like me that they have to look through all of them before, and you don't hear the speaker. I'm that way, to be honest with you, right? But we'll talk about this as you get it in just a moment. First, let's talk about the different types of grief that kids experience. The first couple are pretty obvious. The first one is death, right? And there are two types of death that I would call unfair, okay? Almost all death is unfair, but one is when a kid loses a parent at an age of that the kid's at that you're mentoring, right? It's unfair, even if it's expected or whatever else. Give you an example of where it was fair, even though I didn't like it. My dad died when he was 75. That was fair. You follow what I'm saying, right? I wasn't devastated by that. It was hard, but I overcame it because I've already become my own self as opposed to being 13 or 14, right? So the other kind of death that we won't spend too much time on is when a parent loses a young child. Those two are what we would call trauma, which I'll explain more about a little bit, rather than just grief. I'll just kind of give you a precursor. We've all experienced grief, not just death. There's grief, but not all of us have experienced trauma. We'll talk about trauma a little bit, what that means, what that is. The next kind, where you can fill in the blanks, is called divorce. Now, this is about kids, not us, right? How is divorce grief for kids? Most all kids, and this is stuff that I've learned from kids. I forgot to mention to you, there's the two key things that I like about working with kids as a mentor. This ties in with what I'm talking about with divorce. One is that I'm a student of them. Yes, I have a master's degree and I have a lot of knowledge, but I learn from them, and that's where those curious questions come from. I can't tell you how much I've learned from kids, right? The other thing is humor. And I'm biased. Those of you who know me wouldn't be surprised I'm going to say this, but humor is one of the main ways to get into a kid's heart. Not every kid, but most kids. It's just, I can't tell you how many boys, especially I've worked with, that are resistant to counseling. By the end of the session, they actually want to come back, mainly because of the humor that we install within the first time, right? So those two things for myself. So divorce. For most kids, when parents divorce, it's a death in their life. Now, those of you who are divorced, this is not meant to put you on a guilt trip. This is just stating it through the eyes of kids. It's a death in a kid's life, because part of their foundation is mom and dad being together or being on the same team, or at least being in the same house. And when that ends, it's a death for a kid's life, oftentimes, right? The next one, which might surprise you with the R there, is remarriage. I'm going to ask you this question. How is, for kids, not us, remarriage oftentimes grief in their life? Just speak out. You don't have to raise your hand. How is remarriage grief for many kids?
There's a new pecking order as to the oldest, youngest.
Yep.
Step.
Yep. Yeah. Blended family kind of stuff. Anything else?
Who to be loyal to.
Yes. 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 One more. Changes. Yeah. One more thing, and it solidifies. Oh, go ahead.
Hope is gone.
Yeah. Hope in what?
And that they may gonna get back together.
Yes. You read my mind. It's the final nail in the coffin that mom and dad will never get back together. Okay. So remarriage is oftentimes a grief issue for kids, even though this is where there's a polarization, because it's happy for the parent that remarries, but they don't sometimes think about what it's doing to the kid. Isn't always the case, right? Does this make sense so far, right? And these last two I've learned from kids. I've never read this stuff in a book, what I just am sharing with you, right? Because I'm a student of kids. I learn from them all the time, right? With those curious questions. This next one, I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on, the year 2020. Okay? Why would I share that? Now, before I share that, there's another type of grief you really need to know about that I've learned about the last 2-3 years. It's when things cascade upon each other and they just kind of loom over time and they don't go away. That creates grief. Okay? An example in my life, before we get to year 2020, my son, who's doing really well, by the way, since he was about 20, so I'm not painting this picture that he was a monster, even though it felt that way then. Oh, by the way, I forgot to tell you, since he was 12, I don't judge parents anymore. I just do not judge parents anymore. Seriously, I do not. Because when he was in middle school and I was a middle school counselor, I felt like such a hypocrite. But then I realized I was simply human, right? Seriously, I just don't judge parents anymore, right? But a lot of struggles he had, which was mostly on him, some on us, it just didn't go away. So to a point where I was just grieving. Not that I was upset that he was ever born, but I just was grieving because it just didn't go away, right? So that's an example of what the year 2020 did to kids. The whole COVID experience. Here's what I saw firsthand as a middle school counselor, with middle schoolers supposedly learning on Zoom. I put that in quotes because I flat out tell you that kids middle school and younger, and high school is a bit different, they do not do well learning on Zoom, because middle school kids have to experience things to make it real. And for kids, not as much us, you can't experience Zoom, right? You can't feel it, you can't touch it, right? That dynamic as well. So with that Zoom experience, it did two things to kids in that year 2020, which still affects them, by the way, even though those things aren't happening anymore. One, it took them away from the routine of school. We all need routine in life. Whether you're a scheduler or a planner or a spontaneous person, I hope you have routine in your life, because that's what makes us do well in life, right? So it took them away from the routine of school education. And so because of that, by the way, many kids are delayed, not just IQ-wise, but even EQ, emotional intelligence. We have many freshmen and sophomores that assume in some ways they're more like 7th graders. And that's not about them, it's because of what happened that year and since then, right? How they respond to things emotionally and what they know intellectually, right? And then the second thing it did, this is very important, it took them away from their peers, right? And that matters to us, but it matters tenfold for kids, right? Especially adolescents. And so because of that, I'll be blunt with you. I'm exaggerating my point a little bit, but since the masks have come off, which I'm supportive of, the mental health issues have come out with kids, especially middle school and younger. Lots and lots and lots of anxiety, right? It's like a pandemic now, just the anxiety, right? Kind of being aware of that. So what I'm pointing out is just how the cascading events over time that in one of them in themselves isn't necessarily grief, but if you collide them all together, it creates grief. Does that make sense? So kind of being aware of that. Having a parent, a close member who has an addiction issue, and not so much like addiction like, social media, although that can be that, more the lethal addictions like drugs, alcohol, and gambling, right? Because those things destroy trust. There's so many other things I could say because I was a drug and alcohol counselor for 10 years, but they destroy trust, which then affects their ability to trust other people in life, like mentors and also other people like that as well. That's grief as well. So I'm teaching you something you probably already know. Grief is more than just death. And I would suggest to you that all of us, including kids, have had some form of grief in our life, right? So some subtle, some obvious, some a lot. Like some of you are tired of grief in your life. It's like, I'm done with it, right? Being aware of that. By the way, on a side note, I love our country, but I'll say this, that part of why our country struggles is because we don't embrace grief. I don't mean like it, but we pretend it's not there. We avoid it, and we self-medicate through TV or whatever, and then we wonder why we struggle, right? That's many, not just our kids, but even us, right? So I'm going to ask you, I'd love to hear from several of you, what are other types of grief that kids maybe encounter that besides what we've shared?
Health issues.
Yes. Yeah. Right.
I'm not sure if this counts, but like, what about like abuse?
Yes, correct. Yes, definitely. That's a little bit more the end of trauma, but grief and trauma, yeah, definitely. Anything else? Yeah, health issues, somebody you might know. Like a good example of why my son struggled in high school is because his sister, who's 21, is healthy as anything right now. She's Down syndrome, but she's a bundle of joy. She had leukemia from 1 to 4, and he was only 4 years older than her. That was grief for all of us, but especially him, because our focus was on her, the sister thing, all those things. That's the grief without her even dying, right?
Unsafe homes.
Yes, correct. Yes, definitely. Other grief?
Betrayal,
Yes, betrayal.
friendships.
Yeah, correct. Those things as well. Yeah, great. So keeping in mind, I think it's common that we've all experienced that. So what does this mean, this sheet? Briefly, I'll share it with you, and I'm going to tell you a background about it. You don't need to write this down. This is more just information before I go over this. There's a woman named Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in the 60s and 70s that created much of what you're seeing in here about different feelings that come with grief. The mistake she made, even though I'll give her credit for coming up with these ideas, two things. She put most of these emotions all in one line, like you have to feel one before the other. If any of you have experienced grief before, it's never that simple, right? That's the arrows simply mean they interconnect. Don't worry about which direction they go. The other mistake she made, which the person that put this together, a colleague of mine, just was masterful. Instead of adjustment, she made the mistake of putting acceptance. My dad died of a heart attack 15, 16 years ago, and I still haven't accepted his death, but I've definitely adjusted. Every day there's a void in my stomach, somewhere in my body that my dad's not there for me, and I couldn't have talked to you about my dad's death 10 years ago, but I've adjusted, right? So can you see how that dynamic? It's very important you need to know this in terms of working with kids, but even other people you know. One of the few things we cannot fix in life is grief. You can't fix it. You have to adjust and work, and work through it means that you adjust, you don't accept. Do you see the difference of what I'm saying? Accept just means, okay, my dad's dead. It's like, I'm not going to even think about it anymore. That's inhuman that I would even try to do that, right? So what is a couple of these? So let me go over this again. With my dad's death, this is my journey, not yours necessarily. He died very suddenly of a heart attack 15, 16 years ago. So when that happened, I had shock and anxiety. To be honest with you, I didn't have a denial, but what that meant, it was like a car accident where I was numb for about 4 or 5 days. I had to put my emotions on hold. It was a way of self-preserving, protecting myself, which was healthy for a little while. And then for the next 6 months to a year, he died in March, including even Christmas, I had a lot of emotions in the shaded area. and I'll explain a couple of them because most of them should make sense to you. Bargaining. Bargaining means if only. And what I went through for about 2 weeks, about 3 months after he died, was if only I would have done this, my dad wouldn't have died. None of it made sense, but it sure felt that way. If only, right? If only. If only I would have been a better parent, my son wouldn't be struggling when he was 14, 15, right? Some of that was true, some of it wasn't. Another one is happiness. It's not happy that the person died or mom and dad divorced, but I'll give you a really good example. The very same dad that I just told you about, where I got my sense of humor, is a lot from him. The more he loved people, the more he teased them, big time. And so we had a service down in LA where my parents lived that was at a Catholic church, and it was more serious. But we had the reception at my mom's house because she was still alive, and my cousins from San Diego were there. That their dad and my dad were close and things like that. And so my dad and their dad used to always give each other, and I don't mean this in a bad way, crap, but in a way of affection, right? You follow what I'm saying, right? And by the way, adolescents do that all the time. And so eventually, hopefully, you can even do that with your mentee, but in a loving, caring way, if that's their language, right? That's a side thing, right? So if you would come in that room in my mom's house, the living room, and saw us, you would never have thought that we were grieving the loss of my dad, because all we did was laugh. So a quick example, and you don't have to fully get this joke because you're not part of my family, but my uncle, who's my cousin's dad, used to always tease my dad about how cheap he was with money, but in a loving, caring way, right? And so it was so funny because one of my cousins parked in front of our house not knowing that there was a sign that you couldn't park there. He got a parking ticket. So when it was all done, we were already done laughing. He showed me the ticket, and so he jokingly looked at me, he said, "You pay for this." Because that's what my dad would have done with my uncle. Do you follow what I'm saying? And that's generational humor. We did that my dad's service, after the service. So that's an example of happiness in the midst of grieving, right? So does that make sense? And then eventually we get to adjustment. Very important, you need to know this. Please write this down, not necessarily in this, but somewhere else. This comes from my research lab on working kids. I've never read this in a book. Kids grieve at a slower rate than we do, especially middle school and younger. Why? One of the reasons why is I will tell you something that I heard about 10 years ago that was so helpful, which I will share with you. And what this guy said was so powerful yet so simple. He said the brain develops from back to front, and the back of the brain is the amygdala, and there's other things too. And that's what he called the acceleration of the brain, like the acceleration of a car. So think of 3-year-olds and middle schoolers. I put them in the same category, by the way, okay, for purposeful reason. It's all about how they feel. Whatever they feel, they do. That's the back of the brain. That's the acceleration of a car. You follow what I'm saying, right? That dynamic as well. The front of the brain, which unfortunately is the last to be developed and takes even longer since 2020. Notice my point from earlier, right? A lot earlier, right? A lot later. That's the brakes, which is what I call wisdom, which means to say I don't always have to live based on my feelings. Now, some of us in this room, including myself, this is not fully developed. Just ask my wife. But you get what I'm saying. So can you see how with that analogy I just gave you, why kids take longer to grieve, right? Does that make sense? So somebody dies that they're really close to when a kiddo's 10. Mom and dad go to a grief class and they're doing better. Suddenly they wonder why Johnny's acting out at 15, 16. Some of that may have to do with grief, right? So just kind of keep that in mind in terms of that dynamic. Any questions about grief before we move to trauma or comments?
So do people ever go from adjustment back into that
Yes.
gray area?
Yeah, they do. And one example of that is a good segue. One of the main emotions that comes with trauma, which we'll get into a little bit more in detail, is anxiety. And so what comes with anxiety from some people based on the trauma is what we call PTSD, where they come back up here, right? Something triggers that in you, right? Example of trauma for me that isn't as apparent as it was even 10 years ago was I grew up with my mom having grand mal seizures from age 12 on. And that I was always on edge from that happening. It was scary when it first happened, and I won't go into it. But to this day, when I hear people about, like clients I have that they know a parent or somebody has grand mal seizure, that could be a trigger for me, which then causes me to go back up to my grief journey with my mom's seizures. right? Does that kind of make sense? Yeah. So that dynamic. Be aware, this is really, I didn't say this last night. If you know of a kid that lost something, like parents divorce, but especially death within the last 2 years, maybe even longer, almost every Thanksgiving and Christmas is going to be hard for them, and birthdays, right? I noticed every year that I worked, I don't know about Lisa and Brian, if you guys saw this, but as a school counselor, behaviors and other issues really, really ramped up between Thanksgiving and Christmas. You need to know that with kids, that time of year is either joyful or it really sucks. I mean, I'm exaggerating my point, but you get what I'm saying, right? So just be aware of that. Any other questions about grief before we get to trauma comments? Go ahead.
With divorce, what if the child was really, really young when the parents split up? Like it's not something that they can maybe.
Yeah, kids, be aware that I'm more skilled with middle school and older, but know that the younger the kid, the more that it affects them later on in life. In fact, I just remembered a story that I forgot last night in light of your question. This was so powerful for me as a school counselor. When I first started working in the middle school, I worked out for 20 years. 2 years into that, so this was a long time ago, this girl came to me, signed up to see me as a school counselor. It's a 7th grade kid. I looked at her GPA before she came to see. I never knew her. 4.0 student, accelerated program, sweetheart of a kid. I thought, wonder why she's seeing me. It's like, well, she said to me this, and this was so stunning for me, and this goes into what you're asking. She said, Mr. Black, I just need to ask you about something. And I go, what? She said, well, when I was 4, something really bad happened that all these years didn't affect, but now that I'm 12, it really affects me. I don't know why. She said, well, when I was 4, my dad was murdered. And all these years, I didn't think much about it, but now that I'm 12, it really affects me. And so why I say that helped me to understand the world of so many kids that are 11 or younger. Parents divorcing at 6 starts affecting them around 11 or 12 because they start feeling more, they're starting a self-awareness, that kind of stuff. So I don't know if I answered your question, that dynamic as well. Now, I know you're not counselors, you're mentors. It doesn't mean you have to have the skills to have them work through all of it, but you can just indirectly, at least through that, in terms of being dynamic of that as well. Let's move on because of time. So if you go to trauma, what is part 3? What is trauma? How might it be similar and different than grief? There's a few things I'm going to go through fairly quickly, but then I'll stop and share. Again, I love metaphors. So grief is like a sprained, the word there is sprained. By the way, it doesn't matter how you spell it because only you're seeing it. So grief is like a sprained ankle that eventually heals, and we adjust it to it so we can go back to a normal life. Grief still hurts, but we eventually adjust if we handle it in a fairly healthy way. Is that accurate? You know that dynamic as well. Now, as I said before, I didn't put this in the notes, but you can add it if you want. Cascading grief can create trauma. So like a kid has 4 deaths in 1 year. That's probably more in the category of trauma. And we'll talk a little bit more about trauma in a bit, right? Whereas trauma is more severely, it's like a severe broken ankle that affects us for several years, right? Do you see the difference? So I want to really, really emphasize this to you. Not every kid that is in the school system has trauma. Almost every kid has had grief, but not necessarily trauma. So don't assume that your kid has trauma, right? Just being aware of that. 9/11, which was a 2001, is an example of trauma. There's typically a shock factor for the experience of trauma. How was 9/11 trauma? Well, you probably know the answer, especially for the New York area. It shocked our whole country. And emphasize the word with trauma is 2 key things, anxiety and shock, which was, by the way, on here, right? But boy, is it ever present for trauma, shock and anxiety, right? Which is as apparent with grief, right? So being aware of that. There's a shock factor to that. This may not be the best metaphor, but I did my best. Grief versus trauma is like type 1 versus type 2 diabetes. Now, I don't mean at all that diabetes is a bad thing. Please know that. That's the last thing I'm saying. My brother is a type 2 diabetic for 10 years now at least. He has to watch what he eats, but he's not taking insulin every day, right? He's just got to check things here and there. It doesn't interfere with the life too much. Type 1 diabetes, it might not interfere with your life, but in some ways it does, especially at first, because the insulin, and it can be, it's like walking on a tightrope sometimes. And so it is with trauma. It's like, it's really a lot more extreme how it affects people than it is grief. Yeah, you get my point here, right? So being aware of that. We'll talk a little bit later, bear with me on the second page you'll look at later, is that what's some things that you can do to help kids with trauma and or grief, and even in your role as a mentor without being a counselor. So that dynamic as well. But I'm going to go back to what you said more than what I said. I'm just mirroring it. I'm just going to say it by listening and asking curious questions. That's more than anything you're going to see on this, better than anything you're going to see on the second page, right? You guys said that. I'm just mirroring that. It's just, that's how you help them. Even if they don't talk about their trauma, by the way, right? Even if they don't talk about their anxiety, just listening and also asking curious questions, even if it's not about that event, right, so to speak. So let's see. So if you can hand out the ACEs, how many of you ever heard of the ACEs, Acute Childhood Experience? Okay, so as this is being handed out to you, I'll just tell you very quickly. I spent an hour on the ACEs because I've known it for over 10 years. It's intriguing. It's a study they did back in the early 1990s with over 600 adults. They gave them these questions you're seeing in front of you, and they found that adults that scored 3 or higher out of those 10, 11 questions had what they call the high ACEs, which is mean quite a bit of trauma. And by the way, it wasn't, nothing that you're seeing in front of you is their fault, is your fault if it's you, right? It's what happened to you. Do you see the difference, right? There's a shock factor each of those things, at least most of them, right? So they found that. So you, because you're not a counselor, you're a mentor, you won't be giving this to your kids. But keep in mind, as they share stuff with you, what their ACEs score might be. Do you see the difference what I'm saying? Remember, you're not a counselor. You're not there to assess them, right? This is more just something to be aware of, right? So what it helps to understand about how kids struggle in school and sometimes in life. I'm going to ask you, why and how do you think kids that have high ACEs, meaning 3 or more, especially 5 or more, why would they struggle in school? Why and how would they struggle in school? Just throw out some phrases.
They're missing the building blocks.
Yep.
Because they were in survival mode.
Correct. That survival mode is a really good term. Other people? Anything else?
Is it at compounds?
Yes.
Like how you said it, like grief.
Yes. Yep.
The word uncertainty.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. And by the way, that's the key thing that triggers anxiety is uncertainty. There's so many other, I could spend an hour on anxiety because I specialize in it with kids especially. And by the way, I'm exaggerating about the point. I don't know of a person in today's world that doesn't have anxiety of some sort, right? To live uncertainty. We're times of uncertainty, right? Yeah, that place as well. Also, a key thing I'm going to add to some of the traumas, not all of them you see on the sheet that was just handed out to you, is many of them have a hard time trusting, for good reason, by the way, including you. But that's not a statement about you. It's about their story, right? The reason why they're guarded, right? So that dynamic is when you don't trust people, it's hard to move forward in life, right? And then also, the higher the trauma, the more there's the tendency to self-medicate. So people who have high anxiety, why wouldn't they self-medicate? I met with a couple recently. I hadn't met their daughter yet. And they were telling me her story and all the stuff she's going through. And I flat out said to them, no wonder she self-medicates. She smokes pot every day. I'm not saying it's okay she's doing that, but it helped me to understand that. So kids who have high anxiety tend to self-medicate. It might not be something like drugs. It might be social media. It might be gaming all the time. Anything about avoidance, right? So that's the perfect storm of why kids struggle in school. Can you imagine a kid that scores a 7 or 8 on that ACEs and having to sit all day long in school? By the time they get 5th or 6th period, they're just done for good reason. That's all kids, by the way.
Can also be high achievers.
Yeah.
You can
Oh, yeah.
medicate by
Yep.
trying to.
Yep. Correct. That dynamic as well.
Question.
Yeah, please.
With all the media garbage, I'll just call it that.
Yeah.
There is so much out there that you re-traumatize yourself
Yes.
by listening to it
Yep.
over and over and
Yep.
over again. And I had never experienced that.
Yes.
'Cause I have nothing against TV. I just
Sure.
watch them.
Yeah.
But when in a work situation, in a group home, we were watching the news over and over at the top of the hour. It was there for 8 hours.
Yep.
And it really brought to the point of, yes, this is horrendous, but I'm re-traumatizing
Yes.
myself every time I
Correct.
hear that.
Yep.
So,
Yep.
and there's no filter for kids to how many times, because it's spectacular and they get a little bit of a high from
Yep.
what they're watching.
Exactly.
So yeah,
A real life,
media.
yeah, a real life example of that on a different level is that we tried to make a choice as a family about a little over a month ago to try to eat more healthy. By the way, it came from our son more than even us. And I've noticed that since then we're feeling better, we're sleeping better. We cheated last week when we went to Palm Springs, but and that's an example of what do we eat has to do with what we watch.
Output.
Yeah, input output, right? Does that make sense? So good to be able to look at. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
So I've seen something like this before, and the question though that I always have is it's very experiential, but it's like we probably all can relate to each of these questions. Say, oh yeah, there's a time that I experienced that, but it doesn't give a time frame of when something that's an experience that affected you. If it's repetitive, like
Yes.
I mean, I got into a fight with my mom when I was 14, and she pushed me, and it was the only time she ever did it.
Yeah.
But I would be putting a check on here, and
Yeah.
I don't know if that warrants a check.
Yeah. No, I think it would warrant a check, but what you're bringing up is if somebody's been sexually abused, if it's happened repetitively versus one time, that exemplifies the ACEs, right? The one check does matter, but boy, if it's repetitive, how much more the person's in survival mode. Do you know what I mean? That dynamic as well. So that's why you guys, I believe so strongly in the concept of resiliency, because the problem with the ACEs studies is that it focuses on just the doom and gloom of trauma. And resiliency is the answer to that, right? How do we overcome those things? Much like I needed to do on a much smaller scale on the hike I did. I was done. For much of that hike, my mind was on the car rather than on the thing, right? And I made a choice to be resilient despite the fatigue that was still there. That's why I use that as a metaphor for life, right? In terms of that too. Yeah, go ahead. So let's look at these last two bullets, then we'll get into what you brought up, Brian, about, well, how do we deal with this? How would he help kids to be resilient? These last couple of bullets, not everyone has had trauma. I already said that. But let me share with you really quickly a study that I did with my staff at the middle school I used to work at, 35 staff roughly. I gave them ACEs. And what they did was they put on a sticky note without putting their name, the score of their ACEs. And we put on the board their scores. All the ones were here, all the twos were there. You follow me, right? And it was amazing what happened with these people with master's degrees, good teachers, very well-developed people, just like the study 20, 30 years ago. It was just like what they did then, what was exactly what happened with our staff. There was about 40% of us that scored at least a 3 or higher, and another 20%, or out of those 40%, half of them were a score of 5 or higher. And so one of the reasons why our staff, because what I love about this middle school I used to work at, this is still the case, I think, have great teachers. They help me to understand they have great teachers, not because they have a master's degree and are good at what they do, is because they have compassion, not just empathy. Here's the difference. I went through quite a bit of anxiety in my school job because of really bad toxic leadership that I'm way away from right now. I mean, I could not have written that book last year with what I went through 4 or 5 years ago, and I won't go into that right now. But I thank God for what I went through now. I didn't then, because now when people have anxiety, I really get it because I've been there. That's what we call compassion. We all need to have empathy, but compassion is like, I get it. I really get it, right? Do you follow what I'm saying? That's the blessing of ACEs and also adversity in life. It brings compassion to your experience with other people, right? Does that make sense? You may not even say it to your kid, but inside you're really there, right? You can experience it. The main emotion that aligns with trauma is anxiety. I think I said that earlier. So remember, anxiety comes with grief, but a key emotion with trauma is anxiety because it's shocking, right? It's usually shocking, right? There's a sense of hypervigilance. You have to protect yourself or whatever else, right? So remember, I'm going to say this one more time before we move to remedy. Not everybody has had trauma, but almost everybody's had grief. Does that make sense? So don't assume that your kiddo has had trauma just because I'm talking about it right now. What happens in the middle school since 2020, both when I was there, but even still, because I hear a lot about the middle schools, is kids traumatize each other because they each have trauma. Not as much as the high school. In my private practice, I have a lot of kids I'm meeting with in high school, and just through what they tell me, there's issues in high school, but the behaviors aren't as bad as the middle schools. Just what I'm hearing, because they're more mature. Remember the front part of the brain with the brakes, right? Especially juniors and seniors, right? There's a marked difference between freshmen and sophomores versus juniors and seniors in terms of this developing, right? So just from what I've seen. So what we're going to do next is look at the second page, part 4, where you get to some research, then some remedies. The research that so do you want to hand out that other one? Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, correct. Thank you so much. All this is, you can look at it later. Please do not give this to your kid. Remember, you are not a counselor. I give this to kids, but you guys don't, okay? This is just a good gauge for you to know, is my kiddo struggling with anxiety or depression? I don't even use this as a formal assessment. It's more just a gauge. And this is, you could read this yourself later, but the anxiety part is just, this shows you that your kiddo is struggling with anxiety. This shows you that your kiddo is struggling with depression. Guess what? You might have a kid that has neither, right? You follow what I'm saying? If your kid has a lot of anxiety and depression without filling this out with them, maybe it points to the likelihood that they've had some trauma or under a lot of grief in their life. Do you follow what I'm saying, right? So do you talk about that with them? Maybe not. They may not want to talk about feelings, but then you know a little bit about their background without even saying it, right? Does that make sense? So yeah, go ahead.
I just have a quick question. When we're talking about the brain development from the back to the front, and we know just a normal course of maturity in life, there's a process. Would trauma or grief slow down, kind of drag down that process?
Not as much grief, but they've done brain studies that I've seen quite a bit about, that the more trauma, the more it actually literally slows down the brain development from back to front. A lot. And then what slows it down even more is what people with a lot of trauma naturally do is self-medicate with drugs, alcohol, or gambling, which really slows things down, right? Oh yeah. Yeah. Not as much grief, but trauma definitely. I've seen images of it. It's really interesting. So what is... Go ahead.
Trauma from some of the things these kids watch.
Oh yeah.
YouTube.
That-
And it's really bad stuff.
Oh yeah, it is. I would say that it probably doesn't traumatize them, but it could, but at the very least, it will slow down the brain development. Do you know what I mean? There's sort of a difference there. Yeah. So excellent questions. So let's look at part 4. I'll go through these pretty quickly, then back up and share a little bit more. The research that we've learned about resiliency in teens. This first one describes Be the One like nothing else. It's amazing. For 40, 50 years, we've known this research. The main component that has helped kids bounce back from adversity is to have at least one caring adult in their life. Doesn't that describe what Be the One is? Right? And so there's so many studies that have shown that over the years. 40, 50 years we've known that, right? And that's what this wonderful, wonderful partnership does in the schools and for kids and stuff as well, right? And there's so many stories around that we've seen, like the one you shared, Brian, about the girl and other stuff too. The second one is, the most important component is that teens have at least one healthy environment, like school, youth group, family, sports teams, etc. So it's nice to have a mentor, but hopefully they have one system that they can go to, like a sports team with a good coach or something that is a place that's healthy in addition to that one mentor. It could be one teacher, right? That they have. One teacher that we had, I'll brag about him. He retired a little bit before I did. His name's Mr. Freeman. He and I are still good friends. This is in Ferndale. He was a math teacher that did therapy, not literally, but as if it was such an unusual math teacher. Nothing against math teachers, but that was really unusual. He would spend Mondays, because, by the way, for kids with trauma, weekends are rough, and they can't focus on Monday when they come back to school, right, for good reason. So he knew that. So every Monday, he'd spend hardly any time talking about math. He would talk about the weekend, and he'd share stories about Martin Luther King or other stuff. He would basically do almost therapy with kids. And then he'd get to the math on the other days, right? And that's how he grabbed the kids. The key thing, you guys, a little side point, whether it's what you do as a mentor or I do as a counselor or teachers, is it's all about relationship, right? And then the other stuff. It's all about relationship. That's what it comes down to. The research has shown that kids, and by the way, this is more my research than anything I've read, so I say this with confidence. Research shown that kids who have healthy habits tend to be more resilient. And we do too, by the way. Healthy diet, healthy sleep, and then the third one is, what do you think the third one is? Any guesses? Healthy diet, healthy sleep. What's the third one, do you think? Actually, exercise. Yep. And I think this describes us as well, but with kids in particular, when people struggle with anxiety or trauma or grief, those things go away, right? We self-medicate doing other things other than those healthy habits. There's one guy I worked with this is one of so many examples in my research lab as a counselor. So many examples. But about a year ago, I met with a guy, 21 years old, that was more developmentally 17, right? Because remember 2020, right? Functions well, goes to work, great guy, funny, musician like me. I felt bad because we had one session where we talked the entire time about music, and I felt bad that he paid me because I could talk about music for 7 hours, right, Amy? I played with her husband quite a bit in the church band, so because I love music, and so, but that was a way of bonding with him, by the way, right? So, by the way, as a mentor, if you have something in common with someone else that's fun, part of your mentoring is just talking about the entire time about that fun thing that you both love, right? Seriously. So anyway, my main point is that he drank every night, this guy, and but yet he functioned well during the day. But part of why he drank so much is because he had tons of anxiety, like a lot of kids that age do, by the way, young adults. So what he did what I call the great exchange. This is somewhat my idea, but a lot of his idea. He started working out 3 or 4 times a week. And the more he worked out, the less he drank. And that was more important than him seeing me, right? And then with that came better diet and better sleep, right? So just part of the plant, what you can plant as a mentor as you listen and ask curious questions is just picking maybe one of those habits with them, as planting a seed without telling them what to do. You get what I'm saying, right? So those 3 things really matter a lot based on research. The first 2 are others, the last one is more mine in terms of what helps that. So what is your role in helping a teen who has experienced grief and trauma? First one is, I think this is really true for this group because of what you guys shared earlier when we first met today. Be genuinely yourself. Teens can spot when an adult is being fake. My son, when he was 16, he told me that, Dad, most adults are really fake. Here's what he meant. I'll speak about myself, not you, but it could apply to you. When I am working with kids, middle school, high school, I'm most importantly Mike Black, then I'm Mr. Counselor, rather than the other way around. Kids know when a teacher's being fake is when they're focusing on the curriculum more than the relationship and just being themselves. Mr. Freeman, he was himself because he would do therapy with the kids because that's part of who he is. Then he'd focus on his math. You follow what I'm saying? So don't get caught up on, I need to ask the right question here, or did I do the right thing, or whatever else. Don't edit yourself too much. Just be yourself while being a mentor. Go ahead.
Just to add to that, my second one, I had that. And I know she totally didn't want to see me again after the first visit. And I think I really was trying too hard.
Yes.
And good friend here, Brian, says, just be yourself.
Yeah, exactly.
Margie, just be yourself.
Exactly.
Yep. And that goes in my head all the time when I meet with him now. Just be yourself.
Be yourself. It's so good.
And it's the best, advice I've ever heard.
It's awesome.
Someone tell me.
Speaking of,
Really,
it's really good. Speaking of being a student to kids, I worked with a kid about a year and a half ago who had tons of anxiety. He said to me something. I asked him if I could steal it from him. He gave me advice. He said, Mike, when I have a lot of anxiety, I edit myself. Like, how this camera's on me right now. So editing myself is that I'm going to watch this the next day or two to make sure that I said everything right. But that's what happens in the moment. It's okay. We're supposed to edit ourselves a little bit. Don't you guys agree that some self-awareness is important?
Yeah.
But to do it too much would be like me walking around all over the place and having this camera in front of me where I'm always editing myself. I can't do well if I'm always editing myself. Does that make sense? So, and again,
You're not yourself either.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, and then again, it's normal to edit yourself when you do something for the first year, 6 months. When I was a school counselor working after drug and alcohol treatment, I edited myself a lot because I was new to the school system. So if you're new at this, it's okay to edit yourself at first, like you mentioned, right? but eventually it's about getting into that. So that's what, does that make sense what I said by fake? By the way, something that I do, just a side note, and we'll finally move down so we have time for questions or comments. An icebreaker, by the way, that I do with kids, and this is appropriate for a mentor to do, not just a counselor, because it actually comes from a program called Capturing Kids' Hearts that our school did for about 5 years, but like almost every school, the good things go away after 5 years. Schools are a pendulum where, okay, we're going to do this. Oh, now we're going to do this. Then it switches every 5 years, but that's another story for another time. But it's called Capturing Kids' Hearts. And this was a teacher thing, even though I do it so I think it would be appropriate for you to do it. Kids love this. Tell me about your happy and crappy for this week. Oh, it's such a great conversation starter. And you could share yours as well, as long as it's not too personal, right? It is such a good thing. And that's about being real, not fake, right, in terms of that dynamic. Another thing that I do, because I love joking around a lot, is that I do icebreakers with kids. And so I have these cards called Would You Rather cards. And kids love Would You Rather. These are actual cards. And there's ridiculous things we would never do. We have to guess each other's answer. My wife made the mistake of getting me this last Christmas, this dad jokes cards. And so, but I believe this is an oxymoron, they're actually clever dad jokes cards if there's such a thing. Let me give you an example of one real quick, okay? I've got this one memorized. I love this one. What do you call a nervous javelin thrower? Anybody want to guess? Except for the ones that were here yesterday, because you always know the answer. What do you call a nervous javelin thrower? Anybody? The answer is Shakespeare. I love it. Anyway. And it's so funny. I have this one girl who's a 7th grader. I've been meeting with her for 4 or 5 months. She claims that she hates my dad jokes. She always says she's going to walk out of the room, and we kind of give each other the business. We give each other crap all the time, but she loves it, right? She can't wait for the dad joke, right? So it's pretty fun. So again, humor is oftentimes the way into a kid's heart, right? So
I love that one.
Yeah.
I love dad jokes.
Yeah.
I was just like, the other day I was telling her, I said, you know how Little Caesars cuts their pizza? The Little Caesars.
And
And she laughed.
isn't it great?
I love it.
It's so fun when they, like this one girl, it's so fun when they pretend they hate it, but they love it.
Yeah,
You know, just,
I know, and it's so fun to get the spontaneous laugh.
yeah,
you know.
it's pretty fun. So the next one, which you guys are championing at from what you shared earlier, is that especially with grief, we can't fix grief or trauma, so simply be there and listen without giving initially advice. I cannot emphasize enough, you guys, that grief and trauma is one of the few things that we cannot fix. Just be there and listen, right? Does that make sense? So they have enough people nagging at them in their life, teachers and parents. If you're a parent, you know that we nag. My 26-year-old son, I know I still nag him, not as much as I used to. That's part of our job description, right? But that's something a mentor shouldn't do is nag, because they get that enough from other people, right? So being aware of that. This is really, this is a good one, some bullets. These are just ideas I want to give you in your role as a mentor, not as a counselor. Build on their strengths and supports in their life. How do we do this? Questions to ask to help them building up from their strengths. The difference between your role and my role is this. My wife's a life coach, which is somewhat similar to a mentor. A mentor focuses on the present and the future, hardly at all on the past. You agree with that? That's it. Whereas I deal with the present and the past, not much on the future. That's sort of the difference, right? So a mentor focuses on strengths, which has to do with building on the future, right? So with that, here's some things you might do. Tell me about a time you struggled with something similar or just overall, and what helped you to overcome the situation. Now, these things that I'm reading to you right now, you want to do this after you've established a relationship with the kiddo, not in the first 1 or 2 times, right? They have to know you and trust you by that, right? What are 2 things that others who know you well say are your strengths? Usually if you ask them what are your strengths, they'll say, I don't know, because they're so used to focusing on the things they struggle in. Remember, part of adolescence is they don't know themselves yet, even though they think they know it themselves, and by the way, about everything else. Right? And so I had a girl that I met with yesterday in counseling, and I've known her for almost a year, and so she has a friend that named Elise. She's in another county because we do counseling online, and so you wouldn't know her. And so I said, well, what would Elise say are your strengths? Because she's really had a bad 2 or 3 weeks. And I didn't ask her what are your strengths, but what would Elise say? And she said, oh, she'd say this, this, and this, right? And from that, I'm hinting that this is how you can make it out of this situation, which you've talked to me about 20 minutes ago, right? get what I'm saying, right? So being aware of that. One strength that I see that you have is blah, blah, blah. Can you use this characteristic to help you through this situation? Here's something I've seen about you I really like, right? Can you see that dynamic as well? What are some true norths in your life that can help you during this time? In my book, I spend a whole section on true north. Just as compasses have true norths, we need true norths. Agree with that? And true norths are things, our values, are like values. Our feelings will change tomorrow, but hopefully our values or true norths won't 5 years from now. So to even ask a kid, what are your true norths? What do you mean by that? Well, things that you value now that aren't going to change 5 years from now. What are they? And how can these true norths be there for you during this difficult time? Does that make sense? So you're telling them there's such a thing as rhetorical questions. All that means is that you ask a question that's really a statement. That is such a good skill to have, rhetorical questions, right? That's sort of a sneaky way of giving advice, but it's really good, right? So what are the true norths in your life? So does these make sense, these questions? So can you see how these questions tie into overcoming trauma or grief, even without talking about it, right? Can you see that? How that goes with that? So kind of being aware of that. A couple of other things before we have time for comments or questions. When to refer the teen to other sources for help. One, you hopefully know when there's a safety issue, right? It's when you talk to your supervisor and be the one to talk to them about it. Just, hey, I need to help with this situation. Another one is just if you peek at this other handout that I showed you earlier about adolescent assessments, if you find that the kiddo has probably a lot of anxiety based on what you're seeing here, but you meet them for 6 months and you just see that their anxiety is getting worse, just share that concern with the person you're working with here and say, I feel like they might need more than that. You know what I mean? And does that make sense? Just sometimes your gut feeling goes good with that, right? Then just that as well. Doesn't mean you're not doing a good job. They just need more than that. There's times where I meet with kiddos and or adults and I refer them to a psychologist for assessment because they need more than what I'm offering, which is not a knock on me. It just means I'm partnering with someone else to help that kid, right? But I want to just state this. I think I said it earlier. Without you doing a formal assessment by a kid filling out the ACEs, because that's not your job. But as you hear their story and you think, ooh, this kid's got a lot of ACEs, they got a lot of anxiety, know that their movement of making changes is going to be really slow, right? Because it's hard to run a race with a sprained ankle, right? So just being aware of that. That's where you need a whole team, like Brian, the girl that you mentioned about. Not only was it the mentor, but also they changed her schedule, right? It was that thing that I talked about at the top of the page you're looking at. You don't just need a mentor, you need a healthy system and also those habits, all that stuff, right? Being aware of that. The last one is be aware of your own issues in life. There's a term I learned that you don't need to write down unless you want to, because it applies a little bit more to counselors than mentors, but it's good to hear this. It's called countertransference. All that means is, what are the issues that I bring into the room with kiddos or a group I might be leading when I was in drug and alcohol treatment or as a counselor or as a school counselor or in my private practice? There are certain issues that might come up that might be triggers for me. And how do I deal with those things? So one for me, I'll just be vulnerable with you guys for a moment, is when I was 12 years old, my mom started having grand mal seizures, ironically at the age of 42, right? Which is a mystery to me because most people have it out of childhood. And so when I was 12 years old, we were listening to music in the summertime and she just fell over and the whole grand mal seizure thing. That was trauma for me, you could probably imagine. But she continued to have seizures. So that was ongoing trauma for me, right? And it's not even the ACEs. And so when I talk with somebody that talks about somebody that has that grand mal seizures, that's a trigger for me. So I'm aware of that trigger, right? Because something you might want to write down, by the way, something I learned at Fuller, this ties with the countertransference thing, is that this is something that helped me so much, that what people need when they're in crisis, or even when they're not, like your mentee, they just simply need a non-anxious presence. So this is really important. When some kids are really drawn to drama, right? How do they feel? Man, that everybody has to feel it too, especially middle school, right? So don't get caught into that so much that you're an anxious presence as well. Does that make sense what I'm saying? Their drama doesn't have to be your drama. But part of that is if you've had a lot of drama yourself, be aware of that drama so you can work through it. the more that we as adults can work through this stuff around grief or trauma and get to adjustment, the better off we're going to help people as a mentor or as a counselor, right? So that's all I mean by being aware of your own issues. That's really important. So we've got about 10 more minutes, and while that's happening, Lisa's going to hand out some remaining handouts that you can do. There's one of them, by the way, I get permission to do this. It's about the book that I wrote, and also it's about a class that I'm going to teach at Christ the King Bellingham, the church that I go to next Tuesday. It actually was a blueprint for the book that I wrote last year, and I've done the class now. It will be 3 times. It's free. It's not about helping kids. It's about your own journey or people you know. If you yourself, somebody you know has a lot of trauma that they still need to work through or adversity, that's what that class is about. It's called Beauty for Ashes. The other stuff is fairly self-explanatory. Any questions or comments? We've got about 7-8 more minutes, and then I know Nancy was going to share a few things. Go ahead.
Just a question about anxiety. Like, does it always have to stem from something traumatic, or
Nope.
are some people just hardwired? Because I know, like, I've always been anxious from probably birth.
Yep.
I'm like, is there something like repressed that I
No, yeah. Well, here's my card. No, I'm just kidding. Is that? No, I love that question. Some of us are just born with it. I went to a workshop online about 2 years ago, and this really, really, really good speaker, she said that 70% of kids that have, let me reword that, of kids who have anxiety and an anxiety disorder, at least 70% of their parents, 70% of those kids have one parent with anxiety disorder as well. And that isn't so much focusing on blaming the parent as much the genetic aspect of it. So some people are hardwired for anxiety, and not just the trauma stuff. Yeah. This ties in a little bit what you shared, is that it might be a bit different with mentoring, and Lisa or Nancy or Danny or Brian, you can speak to this if you want. But there is a place at times for self-disclosure where you can share some of your own story, as long as it's not too much and it's for the benefit of the mentee. Because it helps with that compassion that you can relate. By the way, I put this in bold print. One thing you do not ever want to say to a kid, no matter how well-intentioned, is to say, I know what it's like to be a teenager. It does not work. It's going to destroy trust, because we do not know compared to each generation changes. You could say I identify when I was 15, but it's not the same as saying I know what you're going through. Does that make sense? That's the last thing you want to say to kids, is I know what you're going through. I was once a teenager, because that's being fake, to be honest with you, right? It might mean well, but it doesn't work.
Say what you said last night, like where you preface, like sometimes you might want to share, but
Yeah.
you preface with.
Yeah, you want to say in advance, your experience might be different than mine, but I just want to share something with you that I went through when I was younger, but it might not be the same, at that time. Yeah. So self-disclosure is good, as long as it's not too long, it's just for the purpose of them opening up or sharing or whatever else. And maybe to say, my happy and crappy this week, I've had a crappy week there's some family issues, my son's having a hard time, and just leave it at that. You don't have to go into detail. Just so you know that you're human, right? That you struggle as well. Part of why I think I'm an effective counselor is because I have a viewpoint that we're all broken, which helps me to be not better than anybody else around me, right? Two types of people that really turn me off, just to be honest with you, is know-it-alls and self-righteousness, right? And I know a lot, but I hope I'm not a know-it-all. There's a very big difference, right? Very big difference. Go ahead.
You touched on this a little bit, but I think we acknowledge that kids nowadays, they have so much stacked against them. I didn't grow up with social media, and I find myself being really empathetic towards the teens that I know, or the young adults, saying, wow, you guys have it really hard. But I'm wondering how they hear that. Are they like, oh, I'm so glad that someone knows, like who's empathizing with us? Or are they like, just give me a break. I don't want to hear that. Like, what do you think they feel when you're saying, yeah, you guys have a really, you've got this is bad.
Yeah, it's you would say, there's a balance. Say you're going through a really hard time, or social media or whatever stuff, but then to ask them, it's okay to ask. I think even your role as a mentor, what would you like out of our time together? Like, just what would be a goal? What's one thing I can help you with, right? Because part of why they're seeing a mentor, part of why people see a counselor, and or other, even seeing somebody, a doctor, is because we all get stuck in patterns in life, don't we? Right? We all get stuck, and so really, what part of why they're seeing you is that because They want to, but they don't want to get unstuck. Here's what I mean by that. I have a viewpoint, before I get to you in a second, that all of us, this isn't just kids, we're all either apprehensive or resistant to change. Okay? I'm only saying this because to note why I'm saying this. It's not so much the spiritual aspect of it. So bear with me as I say this. In Romans 7 in the Bible, Paul says, I do the things I don't want to do. I don't things I should. What a wretched man I am. Whether you're spiritual or not, that's our experience every day. All right? And your kiddo is that way. That's part of why they're seeing you. So think in the back of your mind, how can I help them to get unstuck? Without even saying it directly. Do you follow them? So you want to be empathetic, because it's great you're empathetic. That's huge. But at the same time, we don't want to be so empathetic we enable them not to change, right? And yet we don't want to, the other side of having them change, because all you're doing is giving advice. So there's a balance between the two. There's a balance real quick between enabling them, where we're listening too much and too much empathy, which is versus the other extreme, which is more just guiding them like a parent where you're just giving advice, right? Just a balance somewhere. And we all err one way or the other. Like I'll just quick comment, when I first got married, I made the mistake of being so empathetic that my wife put it spiritually, she was pretty blunt. She said, Mike, you're enabling them in their sin. you know, it doesn't matter whether it's sin or not. And now I've learned, it's so interesting. I love how marriage works, because my wife and I have balanced each other out so much. Because she was more kind of, just hard line, it's got to stop here for the good. I was more Mr. Empathetic, and we balanced each other out. So she's more empathetic, I'm more, okay, that's enough, right? Just kind of balance. I wish we had parented that way. No, I'm just kidding.